next section. And as our picture has started to develop here today, it's becoming clearer that there are places on the landscape that provide better opportunities to reduce the impacts of annual grasses, other locations to defend from invasion, and perhaps some sites that we really just don't know how to restore yet. In our next segment, we'll explore how large, complex landscapes provide different opportunities and threats related to annual grasses. So with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker here with Andrew Olson, who is the Science to Implementation Coordinator for the Intermountain West Joint Venture. Based in Missoula, Montana, he assists partners across the 11 states of the Intermountain West with accessing, interpreting, and applying science to their land management needs and challenges. I would also like to welcome back Brian and Jeremy.
Well, thank you, Erica, so much for helping us along here. And it's really my pleasure to be in this virtual workshop with all of you and continuing this story. This content really builds on itself. And now we're addressing one of these two fundamental questions. It's sort of where do we work and what do we do? And this session is focused on where do we work? How do we pick the best places to invest in invasive annual grass management? Acknowledging that, we have limited resources, time, funding, and in most landscapes, there's more invasive annual grasses than we can deal with. And so there's lots of ways to think about how to be strategic. Like Brian said at the beginning, we're not going to give you a formula or an exact answer or playbook on how to do this. We're going to present you with some principles and ideas to inform this process and have a real life example out of Eastern Oregon that might help you and get the wheels turning in your own partnerships and how you might collectively address annual grasses. So thinking back to our principles and reviewing these once again, you might assume when we start thinking about picking places to work, it's all about considering landscape context. And that's certainly going to be a strong through line throughout this content and something we'll hear a lot about. But all of these principles really apply when you start to think strategically and spatially about where to work. And we'll see these pop out throughout the content and these through lines throughout the presentations and Q&A that follow here. So keep rolling here. Just a few high-level points, just kind of as a teaser for what's to come. Brian and Jeremy are going to unpack more introductory content to kind of set the stage. And then once they're finished, we'll introduce our folks from Oregon that are going to share how they're handling this in Eastern Oregon. One of them that is a key through line is really understanding your position relative to invasive annual grasses and other important habitat characteristics. This is the idea of thinking beyond your project area, beyond the hotspot of annual grasses you're trying to address, and thinking really at a landscape scale. And we're going to unpack that at length here and explain what that looks like in practice and why you should care about that as a strategy. The other is focusing on areas with minimal invasive grass impacts first and really thinking about balancing risk and opportunity. This is the idea of intervening early, prevention, return on investment, and this plays out spatially. And we'll see that as you think about a spatial game plan for addressing annual grasses in your geography and planning for every acre. So this has a couple ideas baked into it. One is just the idea of working together across boundaries, as we heard in the introductory content. This problem doesn't care about political boundaries or ownership boundaries, and it really does require collaborative efforts to address it. But also this is part of the considering landscape context idea too, of thinking through your landscape holistically, understanding why you would do something in one place and not another. It doesn't mean you're doing something on every acre. In many cases, we're making an active decision not to do certain practices in certain areas. And that all falls under this idea of planning for every acre. This is not particularly the idea of intervening early. It's a fairly simple idea, and it's not new to us. I think we inherently understand this. Our friend Benjamin Franklin here, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And Brian's going to spend some time applying this concept directly to invasive annual grasses and weed management and how that works. Jeremy will sort of set the stage for our speakers, but with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Brian to keep walking us through this background here.
Thank you, Andrew. And thanks to everyone that is continuing to submit questions. the level of questions indicates pretty clearly the complexity of the audience that we're dealing with. I appreciate that. Andrew, you talked about this idea of an ounce of prevention, and I think Paul has touched on it as well. This is definitely a theme that we're carrying through today. Some interesting, I won't call it historical data, but some things that we've seen, not necessarily completely recently, but that we've known for a while, is that early intervention not only increases our probability of reducing impacts and further spread from invasive plants across the landscape, but it also is more efficient from a time and effort standpoint. This graph, I've probably shown it 1,000 times in my career. Some research out of California where they looked at 53 independent infestations of 18 different invasive plant species, and they looked at the probability of eradication success and the amount of effort or dollars expended on those projects relative to the initial infestation size at which they started to implement their weed control practices. Pretty clear. There's probably a lot more uncertainty around this, but if you start when you find the very first introduction in a new area, our probability of success is much higher, our likelihood of impacts is lower, and our costs are very much lower. So from a very practical standpoint, early intervention is supported from the weed science literature historically. Paul touched on this a little bit as well, the concept of ecological thresholds. I think there are a few different positions. Chad talked about sort of a Army military campaign approach. And I think if we consider that anything prior to crossing an ecological threshold, and I'm going to touch on this a little bit more, to where we have an opportunity to be proactive, we have sufficient native desirable plants still on that site that allow it to function like a native plant community rather than it functioning like a fully invaded plant community. We have a greater likelihood of maintaining the characteristics that we want on those sites. And this is kind of in that area that we consider to be proactive management. We're going to think about prevention, and then if we have some kind of monitoring in place that would suggest to us that that site may be nearing an ecological threshold to where it tips over to where the invasive annual grasses might be driving the system, then we might implement some kind of aggressive management in such a way to prevent that from occurring. There were some questions about resilience, I think, that cropped up at the end of Paul's discussion, and I did want to point out that one of the things that's sort of a paradox with some of these invasive plant species, and particularly invasive annual grasses, is that we think that more diverse systems are typically more resilient and better able to recover from a disturbance than less diverse systems. But there's a lot of examples where we have high-level invasive annual grasses that once it crosses over to an annual grass dominated state, diversity decreases. That's been a trend that's been shown across the Western US in multiple publications, but it's very difficult to move that system back to a diverse state. So there's a little bit of a paradox there that doesn't necessarily make sense, in that lower diversity should hypothetically be less stable. But when it comes to some of these invasive plant species, once it shifts, it actually tends to stay in that state more than it does move back to some kind of more diverse state. And this happens at different locations and different times across the landscape. We combine some of these previous sort of ecological concepts that we've talked about with the thought of how they are distributed across the landscape, and with some long-standing weed management principles and concepts. I've got things like early detection, rapid response on the left funnel. Got the wildfire model that Steve Dewey clearly articulated about early intervention and thinking about landscape context. And then some of the ideas from New Zealand weed management, site level prioritization versus species level prioritization, And then we combine those with sort of this emerging and really robust field of landscape scale conservation. This is what really excites me about this idea of defend your core. Is we've got a very practical, applied weed science background tied with also what I would say a very practical, but sort of a different focus from landscape scale conservation that leads us into a new era of thinking about how to proactively manage these annual grasses across the landscape. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more with Jeremy and then with Katie and Vanessa.
Great, thanks, Brian. So I get the task of trying to explain perhaps the most foreign concept to most of our participants, which is this idea of considering what we call landscape context. And I'm going to do that through a few scenarios in this hypothetical example here. So imagine in this hypothetical landscape where the tan squares represent invaded rangelands and the green squares are uninvaded rangelands. In this scenario, we don't know the condition of the surrounding lands or have simply chosen not to consider them. So those are the gray areas around us. My question to you is, with a proactive and preventative mindset, where should we work? Site 1 or Site 2? Now, based on Ben Franklin and what Brian just told us, we'd probably pick Site 2, right? That uninvaded rangeland where we still have an opportunity to keep it good before that invasion has even occurred. Prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? Next slide. But what if we were to zoom out? What if we were to get a bird's eye view? In other words, zoom out from where you're standing on the ground and look down upon the area around you and consider the condition of all those lands in your surrounding area. Where should we work considering this landscape context? Site 1 or Site 2? Site 1 is an invaded patch embedded in a relatively uninvaded landscape, whereas Site 2 is an uninvaded patch, but it's surrounded in this otherwise invaded land. Here, Site 1 might actually be more ideal place to work first to keep that invasion patch from spreading into your neighboring areas. Site 2, we could work there, but it'd be really hard to keep it from becoming invaded because of that constant pressure from your boundaries. You know, the minute you take your eye off of it, those lands are going to get invaded, or they might be affected by a more frequent wildfire that happens in the landscape due to those increased fine fuels. Next. Finally, let's take a look at one last extreme example where Site 1 is now an invaded patch embedded in an invaded landscape, and Site 2 is an uninvaded patch in an uninvaded landscape. Where should we work? If given a choice, Site 2 is clearly the best place to work, quote, best place, right, to work given that favorable landscape condition. Based on the principles we're talking about in terms of proactive management and considering this landscape context. Here, it'll be easier and more cost-effective to protect that over time. Landscapes that look like Site 1, you know, many of us work in places like that, and we're not saying you can't work there, but you're going to have to change your expectations for what's possible from prevention and eradication to more of that long-term management and containment of the problem to minimize the worst consequences of a problem that's now widespread. So part of this concept of considering context is informing your expectations about what kind of outcomes you might achieve. But also many of us work in management areas, counties, districts that have options where we could potentially identify sites that look more like landscape 2 and help people who still have an opportunity to proactively save those places, empower them to do that. Next. Putting all this together allows us to deploy this management philosophy we've been talking about this morning that we call defend the core, grow the core. You've heard the term core this morning, but we haven't really defined that. And so we're going to do that here. First, I want to clarify, we're not talking about core from a regulatory designation standpoint, or like I like to think of a capital C core. We have sage grouse cores that have various regulatory designations to them. We're not necessarily referring to that specific type of core. Instead, we're talking about the philosophy of a core, or lowercase c core. Here, core refers to the most intact, desirable native plant communities on the landscape that are least impacted by large-scale threats. And this can be applied to a lot of different types of threats, but in this case today, we're talking about invasive annuals. The graphic on the right illustrates the philosophy. Cores, represented in blue, are the most impact places where we can still provide proactive and preventative care to keep lands healthy. Conversely, the red areas represent lands that are already highly invaded, where treatment is expensive and not likely to be very effective. Yellow areas represent lands partly invaded that are starting to transition to that annual dominance. And arrows represent that preferred direction of management if we have a choice. And the whole idea here is to identify your most intact places at whatever scale you're working and anchor yourself there before moving out. Make sure those lands are taken care of before you start moving out with restoration and rehab at a larger scale, mainly to reduce the chances of getting flanked. What we're doing today is often assuming those places are okay, and we're chasing the problem around the landscape, playing whack-a-mole, and we're getting flanked, and our best lands remaining are getting invaded for the first time. So this whole concept challenges you to flip the script on how we've been doing management in the past. Next. Of course, the ecological condition of the land is just one important component to consider. Cores can and should be refined to incorporate our societal values, our community values, and ecosystem services we want to retain. They also include cultural will or landowner readiness. You know, not every community is ready to take this on, and so we need to build some of that momentum and support to really embark upon this, you know, multi-decade and generational challenge we have. We've branded this defining your core, defending your core, and I'll credit our core team member, Jordan Spock from National Park Service, for coining this as we were sitting around talking about this rather esoteric idea of defining a core with maps and everything that can seem really bureaucratic. But once you start to bring in local values and you start talking about places that are really important to people, and you layer that on top of your inventory of the condition of the land, it becomes personal. And we start to identify those places that local people are going to be invested for the long haul to protect and keep it for future generations. So